A body will only take so much before it stops asking permission. It doesn't check the floor plan to make sure the room is appropriate. It doesn't consult your budget or your terror or the fact that you're standing in the private study of the most powerful criminal in the state, holding a bottle of wood polish and a microfiber cloth. It decides it's finished, and Della Marsh's body had been making that threat for hours before it finally followed through. She hit the floor at 2:47 in the morning. She didn't feel it. That was the strange part. One moment she was buffing the credenza in the east study of the Vance estate, her calves burning, the edges of her vision going soft and white. The next, she was gone, swallowed by a darkness that didn't hurt, which was, honestly, the longest stretch of comfort she'd had in months. Della was 25 years old and she was built for survival, the way old farmhouses are built for winter, barely, and at great personal cost. She had been cleaning the Vance estate 3 nights a week for 4 months through a contracted staffing agency that paid better than the diner on Clement Street, or the fulfillment warehouse on Route 9, where she sorted packages until her fingers went numb. She did not think about the man who owned the estate. She thought about the $94,000. That was the number, $94,000. The exact cost of the surgery that had put her younger brother, Cal, back together after a drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday in November. Cal had been 22. He'd been on his bicycle. The impact had shattered 2 vertebrae and left him with a prognosis the neurosurgeon delivered in the tone of someone reading off a grocery list. Without surgery, permanent paralysis. With surgery, a 60% chance of full recovery. Della had co-signed the loan that same afternoon. 14 months later, Cal could walk. He walked with a cane and a slight drag in his left foot, and a grin that still made Della's chest ache with something that wasn't quite grief but lived right next door to it. He was alive. He was in a studio apartment 2 bus stops from their mother's place. He was okay. Della was not okay. Della owed a man named Douglas Cutler, who ran a private lending operation out of a nondescript office building downtown. $200 a month just to keep him from exercising the clause in the loan agreement that allowed him to collect collateral alternatives. She did not know exactly what that phrase covered. She was smart enough not to ask. So she cleaned. She cleaned the Vance estate and the diner and the warehouse, and she kept her head down and her mouth shut, and she did not think about what happened to people who got on the wrong side of the Vance organization. Because she was not on any side. She was a ghost with a mop. Ghosts didn't have sides. The estate itself was a monument to controlled violence. Everything in it was expensive and cold. Marble flooring, dark oak paneling, reinforced windows looking out over 3 acres of manicured grounds that the groundskeeping crew was never allowed to leave unattended for more than an hour. The household staff moved through it in near silence, trained by years of proximity to Pierce Vance to make themselves invisible. Della had learned the rules fast. Don't use the main staircase. Don't enter the east wing without authorization. Don't make eye contact if Mr. Vance passes through a room. She had seen him exactly 4 times in 4 months. Each time, she had looked straight through him, the way she'd learned to look through all of them. The men in expensive suits who drifted through spaces she cleaned. Trailing cigarette smoke, and the particular smell of money that had been through something ugly to get this clean. Pierce Vance was 34, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. He didn't look at the staff. They were furniture to him. Della was fine with that arrangement. Furniture didn't get fired. She had been working double shifts for 3 weeks because another contracted cleaner had quit without notice, and the agency had asked, politely, which made it more of a threat, if anyone could cover. Della said yes before the sentence finished. 3 weeks of double shifts meant 3 weeks of 6-hour nights at the estate, followed by 4-hour warehouse shifts, a 40-minute bus ride separating each. She had been sleeping in 4-hour intervals for 21 days. The credenza didn't get cleaned. Pierce Vance did not sleep. He hadn't managed more than 90 consecutive minutes in 2 weeks, which was why he was moving through the east wing of his own house at 2:30 in the morning with a glass of water he'd stopped tasting an hour ago. He needed the property disbursement files from the east study before the meeting at 8, and he needed to stop the migraine pulsing behind his left eye from eating through the back of his skull. And he needed, in some general and unaddressed way, to stop feeling like a man who had been buried in a landslide of his own making. He pushed open the study door. His instincts fired before his brain caught up. The particular stillness of a room that isn't empty, the shape on the floor near the credenza that didn't belong to the furniture. He didn't reach for the weapon at his hip. The breathing was too slow, too rhythmic for a threat. He crossed the room and looked down. A woman lay on the rug, curled slightly on her side, one hand still loosely wrapped around a cloth that smelled of lemon and beeswax. She wore the grey uniform of the contracted cleaning service, fabric that had been washed too many times, going thin at the elbows. Her hair had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into, spreading dark across the rug near her cheek. The skin under her eyes was the deep purple grey of someone who had been losing sleep for months, not days. Pierce crouched down and looked at her hands. Her knuckles were raw, nails clipped short enough to disappear, a healing split in the skin at the base of her right thumb, the kind that came from too much chemical contact and not enough time for recovery. He said, "Hey." His voice came out rough, unused since he'd barked at Sawyer 3 hours ago. She didn't stir. He shook her shoulder. She made a small, involuntary sound in her throat, not alarm, just the protest of a body being pulled toward consciousness it wasn't ready for, and then sank back into the deep, even breathing of someone completely under. Pierce looked at the cloth still in her hand. He looked at the furniture she'd been polishing. He looked at the cold, dim room around them. Something shifted in his chest, not pity. He didn't do pity, hadn't permitted himself that particular indulgence in over a decade. Something older and less comfortable. Recognition. He knew what the end of a rope looked like. He'd been looking at it in his mirror every morning. He stood. He walked to the door. He stopped. The east wing ran cold. The ductwork was old. He had told the maintenance team 3 times. He turned back. He bent down, slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted. She barely registered it. Her head rolled naturally against his chest, a small exhale escaping her like a pressure valve releasing, and she stayed completely under. She weighed almost nothing. That wrongness settled in him, the particular wrongness of something that should be heavier being too easy to carry. She smelled like cleaning product and something faint beneath it. Vanilla, the kind from cheap drugstore soap. He carried her up the back staircase to the guest suite in the north corridor and laid her down on the bed, started to pull away. Her hand moved. Not a grab exactly, more like a fall, fingers catching his wrist the way a drowning person's hand finds the edge of a dock. Automatic, desperate. Pierce looked at her face, still completely out. Whatever her waking mind was doing, her body wasn't willing to let go. He looked at the armchair in the corner of the room. He exhaled through his nose. He dragged the chair to the bedside with his free hand and sat down. He was still there when the sun came up. Della woke to a ceiling that was wrong. It happened in layers. The first layer just registered the wrongness without knowing why. The way a note played slightly sharp makes you flinch before you understand why it hurt. The ceiling was too high. The light was too soft. The bed was too... She sat up fast. The room was enormous. The bed she was sitting on was the size of a small country, and in an armchair pulled flush against the side of the mattress, head tilted back at an angle that was going to cause him neck problems, was Pierce Vance. Della stopped breathing. She became aware in the same horrible instant that her right hand was locked around his wrist, not loosely, not politely, but with the iron desperation of someone hanging off a ledge. His fingers were draped over hers, loose but deliberate. She had been holding his hand. She catalogued the catastrophic explanations in the order they arrived. She had sleepwalked. She had done something. She was about to be made an example of. She was still dreaming. She rejected all 4 and settled on careful extraction. She started sliding her hand free, index finger first, then the middle. She was almost clear when his fingers snapped shut around her palm. His eyes opened, not slowly, not the gradual surfacing of a man waking from rest. The switch flipped completely in under a second, and the pale grey eyes that locked onto hers were entirely, terrifyingly awake. Della's heart slammed into her ribs. Pierce looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "I can explain," Della said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. His was gravel, low and perfectly even. "I fell asleep in the study." She pushed the words out before her nerve could fail her. "I think I tripped and I went down and I don't actually remember hitting the floor, which means I passed out. I didn't mean to be here. I wasn't authorized for the East Wing. And I'm sorry, and if you let go of my hand, I'll get my things and I'll—" "You're not bleeding," Pierce said. She stopped. "You were on the rug. You weren't bleeding. I didn't want a corpse in the study." His thumb moved across the back of her hand. Not a caress. An assessment, reading the damage in her skin the way you'd read a map of hard terrain. It was bad for the room. Della stared at him. That's not a real reason. It was inconvenient. For who? For me. He released her hand. The absence of contact was startling. She hadn't realized how warm it had been. "What's your name?" She hesitated one beat too long. "Della." Della. He said it the same way he said everything, without excess, without softness, just the word placed carefully. How many hours have you worked this week? She almost said 60. She said 73, because she was too tired to calculate the lie. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. She noticed, for the first time, the deep shadows beneath his own eyes, the fine tension at the corners of his mouth, the controlled, constant bearing of a man who had been holding something very large for a very long time. Stay in this room, eat when it's brought up, don't come downstairs. You're not firing me, Della said. It came out as half question, half accusation. Pierce looked back at her from the doorway. Not yet, he said and left. He had a background check run by noon. By 1 in the afternoon, Sawyer was sitting across from Pierce's desk with a folder and the neutral expression he wore when he already knew the conversation was going to cause trouble. Della Marsh, 25. Clean record, no affiliations. Her brother Calvin was in an accident 14 months ago, spinal surgery, no insurance. She co-signed a loan to cover the surgical costs. Sawyer paused. The lender is Douglas Cutler. Pierce set down his pen. Cutler ran his operation out of the South End. He was not affiliated with the Vances and had never encroached on their territory directly, but desperate people had a way of drifting into Pierce's district when Cutler's collectors came calling. Pierce had been aware of him the way you're aware of an infected wound you haven't had time to address. How much? Pierce said. Original principal was $94,000. She's been paying $3,200 a month for 14 months and she's barely touched the interest. Sawyer flipped a page. Cutler's had collectors at her apartment twice in the last 3 months. She's working 3 jobs and has been covering unauthorized double shifts here for 3 weeks because she needs the income and didn't want to draw attention. Pierce looked out the window at the bare trees. It was going to snow. The feeling in his chest wasn't sympathy. He had made himself immune to sympathy a long time ago, at considerable expense. It was something more territorial. The cold, particular anger of a man who keeps a clean house and has just discovered that someone has been bleeding on his floors without his knowledge. Cutler had no business touching someone who worked inside these walls. The fact that he was doing it unknowingly didn't change the result. Buy the paper, Pierce said. Sawyer's expression held perfectly still, which was as close as he ever came to blinking in surprise. Buy it. Full principal. Wire it today. Tell Cutler if he contacts her again, or sends anyone to her building, or operates north of the bypass, I'll make it a project. Pierce picked up his pen. It won't be a complicated project. Sawyer stood slowly, tucking the folder under his arm. He paused at the door. You hold the debt when you buy it. I'm canceling it. Pierce. She works in my house. Pierce's tone didn't rise. It simply became the kind of flat that ended conversations and started other things. I don't allow my house to be leveraged against me. Sawyer left. Pierce sat with the window and the grey sky and the strange, restless feeling in his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one. Della signed the new contract that evening, sitting across his desk in the clothes that had been left on the guest suite table. Dark trousers, a soft charcoal sweater, both in her exact size, which she chose not to examine too closely, while Pierce watched her with the expression she was beginning to identify as his default, the complete absence of readable feeling, which was itself a kind of information. He dropped the news about Cutler the way you drop a stone into still water. No preamble, no softening. The debt was gone. Cutler was gone. She would not be hearing from him again. Della had looked at the release document and thought, clearly and without panic, this is what a trap looks like from the inside. Beautiful. Clean. Absolute. What do I owe you? She said. What I paid, Pierce said. Repaid from your new salary over 2 years, no interest, no penalties. He turned a page in the contract. You're not a cleaning contractor anymore. You manage my private wing, my study, my office, the residence floors. No general staff access. You report to me. You want me to be your informant. I want someone who knows how to be useful without being noticed. He looked at her hands, those raw, chemical-burned hands she kept trying to tuck out of sight. You worked 3 jobs for 14 months without asking anyone for help. I trust what I can observe more than what I'm told. Della looked at the pen he'd set on top of the contract. She looked at the man who'd placed it there. He was dangerous in the way that weather systems are dangerous. Not personal, just consequential. She already understood that about him. But he had also sat in an armchair in the dark for hours, holding her hand while she slept, and said nothing about it. She picked up the pen and signed. The private wing was a different country. Downstairs, the house ran on the usual hum of controlled anxiety, staff managing the visible machinery of a household that hosted men who made violent decisions. Upstairs in the rooms she now cleaned alone, there was only silence. Della learned Pierce Vance the way you learn a house you've moved into. Slowly, through what he left behind. He drank one kind of scotch, always neat, and rarely finished the glass. He read actual books and bent the spines back at angles that made her physically wince, but she kept that to herself. He went running at 5 in the morning regardless of weather and returned exactly 41 minutes later. He owned 6 identical black suits and seemed to determine which was which by some system she couldn't decode. He paced when something was wrong. She could track it in the faint, repetitive impressions in the carpet near the study window. He was in the room twice while she cleaned. The first time she offered to come back later. He said, "Stay," in a tone that wasn't a request, then ignored her for the next 40 minutes while he worked through a stack of documents. The second time she found him standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at nothing, and she didn't say anything, and neither did he, and she dusted the bookshelves to the sound of his breathing and the distant city below. When she finished and turned around, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. "Your brother," he said. "He's recovering." Della went very still. "Yes." "Good," Pierce said. He looked back out the window. That was the whole conversation. She thought about it for 3 days. The night the Gallo faction crossed the line, Della woke at 1:40 in the morning to the sound of the private elevator. She'd been in the estate long enough to know its sounds the way you know the sounds of your own body. What was normal? What wasn't? What meant something had shifted? The elevator to the private residence ran nearly inaudible, but its vibration traveled through the floor like a low note. She heard it stop. She heard the doors open. She heard footsteps that weren't right. Della opened her door. Pierce was in the hallway. His right hand was flat against the wall, and his left arm was pressed hard against his side. And even in the dim emergency lighting, she could see that the fabric of his shirt was clinging, dark and wet and wrong. "Go back inside," he said. The control in his voice was costing him. "You're bleeding," Della said. Della. She was already moving. She got under his free arm and steered him down the hall and into his bedroom, sat him on the edge of the bed, turned on the lamp, and went for the trauma kit she'd clocked under the master bathroom sink on her second day. When she came back and got her first proper look at the damage, she kept her face neutral through an act of pure will. A deep laceration along his left side below the ribs, long and jagged, still seeping, not a bullet. The shape was wrong. Something with an edge dragged hard. It was bad. It wasn't kill you tonight bad. "I'm going to clean it and close it," Della said. Her voice was steady in a way she did not entirely understand. "This is going to hurt." "Do it," Pierce said. She tried to hand him the saline bottle first. His fingers weren't working right. She watched him try twice. She stepped between his knees and reached for his shirt buttons without asking, worked them quickly, peeled the ruined fabric off his shoulders. She uncapped the saline and poured it directly into the wound. He went rigid. A sound came out of him that wasn't quite a groan, but lived in that vicinity. His hand found her hip, not deliberate, she thought, just the body's need for something solid. She kept pressure on the wound and didn't move. "Keep breathing," she said, "don't you pass out. I can't carry you." Something moved through him at that, not quite a laugh, the shadow of one. She packed the wound. She butterfly closed the edges. She wrapped the pressure bandage tight, because tight was the point, not comfortable. When she finally stepped back, her hands were covered in his blood and shaking, and she sat down on the floor because her legs had made that decision without consulting her, and she stared at her palms because she didn't have anywhere else to put her eyes. Pierce looked down at her. Whatever he put on in the mornings, whatever the controlled, granite bearing of Pierce Vance actually cost him to maintain was gone. He just looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something enormous for so long that he had stopped remembering what it felt like not to. He reached for her wrists, slowly. He drew her hands away from her face. "Look at me," he said. Della looked. "You did well," he said. "Just that." She let out a breath that came out wet at the edges. "I didn't know what I was doing." "You did it anyway." He didn't let go of her wrists. "That's the same thing." She went to the bathroom and scrubbed her hands under water that was too hot and didn't care. When she came back with a warm cloth and cleaned the blood from his jaw, from the back of his hand, from the smear on his forearm, he let her do it without a word. His eyes tracked her movements with the heavy, unfocused attention of a man whose body was finally, cautiously beginning to soften. "Lie down," Della said. "I need to be available if—" "Sawyer is downstairs. The gate is locked." She said his name for the first time. She hadn't planned to. It came out quietly, the way you set something fragile down. "Pierce, lie down." He looked at her for a moment. Then the fight simply left him, the way a held breath finally releases. He moved back onto the mattress carefully, jaw tight with pain, and she pulled the blanket up and turned off the lamp and turned to go. His hand found her wrist. Not demanding there, the weight of a question, not a command. Della looked at the door. She looked at the hand around her wrist, still careful, even now, even half-medicated and blood-drained. She thought about the armchair in the guest suite. She thought about waking up and not having been alone in the dark. She climbed onto the other side of the bed, on top of the covers, facing him, keeping the careful distance of the bandaging between them. His hand found hers in the dark, and she let him hold it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Pierce exhaled, long and slow and complete, the way a house settles when the last light goes off. He was asleep inside of 5 minutes. Della lay in the dark and listened to his breathing even out. She had walked into this estate 4 months ago as a woman trying to disappear, a ghost with a debt and a brother who needed her to keep going. She had been invisible by design. She had worked at it. She had been good at it. She was not invisible anymore. She should be afraid. She was, a little, in the way you're afraid at the edge of something with no railing. Not because you want to fall, but because you've suddenly understood how far down the bottom is. Pierce Vance was not a safe man, and would never be one. The world he lived in had edges everywhere, and eventually those edges were going to reach her. She was clear-eyed about that. She had always been clear-eyed. It was the only thing that had kept her standing. But lying in the dark with his hand in hers, Della Marsh realized something that had been building quietly for weeks, the way pressure builds before something gives way. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of going back to the life before this room, before this silence, before someone had looked at her raw knuckles and her broken sleep and said without saying it, "I see you carrying this. I see how much it weighs." She had spent 14 months holding everyone else up. She had forgotten what it felt like to have something solid at her back. Her eyes closed. For the first time in longer than she could count, Della Marsh fell asleep without setting an alarm, without running the numbers on what she owed and how far she was from air, without listening for the sound of someone at the door who had come to collect. She just slept. And God help anyone who came for her in the morning, because the man beside her had already made her his responsibility. And Pierce Vance did not let go of things that belonged to him.